But the fact is that since it was wrong, since it was not accurate, since it was not sound, would have brought about that impact, yes.
And so went the intelligence war. Back in that summer of 1967, the CIA knew how unpopular its cause was, trying to force a reluctant Washington to accept the reality of a far larger war. But it had no idea to what lengths the military was prepared to go to keep the estimates of enemy strength under 300,000 men. CBS Reports has learned that in the midst of the national intelligence estimate, General Westmoreland's representatives met here at the Pentagon and commenced arbitrarily to slash MACV's own official estimates of Viet Cong units. It may be that Westmoreland knew nothing about these specific cuts, but they were carried out by his officers who were attempting to keep the total at the level dictated by their commander. One of those who reluctantly participated in that cutting was Colonel George Hampshire.
You were
I was a light colonel.
You were a light colonel with a lot of responsibility in a time of war,
Yeah.
in a small room in the Pentagon,
Yeah.
and you're sitting there with 5 people who are trying to provide the president with accurate intelligence on the enemy.
It was a group grope.
And it was a group grope to do what? To fake figures?
To arrive at a set of figures that MACV could live with.
To fake intelligence estimates.
That's your characterization, and that's too strong for me. My misgiving was that we were faking it. There was manipulation. Yeah.
Is it fair to say that you got together and went unit by unit and arbitrarily decided to reduce the numbers of VC enemy in those categories?
The operative word being arbitrarily, yes.
Colonel Hampshire of DIA, didn't you, in fairness, we ask, in fairness to your own position, sit back in amazement when you watched this performance of arbitrarily cutting certain numbers out of units?
I didn't do that.
No, I know. You
didn't do that.
Well, your people in your command did.
I didn't do that.
It was during your watch, sir.
Well...
And he says, I was aghast.
It was lousy strength estimation. It was shoddy. But we did it.
Now, who actually did the cutting, I don't know. It could have been my chief of staff, I don't know. But I didn't get involved in this personally.
This boils down to another one of the uncomfortable little jobs that you do for your commander. And these vary in degree.
The battle between MACV and the CIA went on for weeks. Before it was over, it would become the most bitterly fought battle in the history of American intelligence. But in the end, the CIA suddenly, without explanation, reversed its position and gave in to all of General Westmoreland's demands. George Allen explains why the CIA gave up the fight.
It was strictly a political judgment, a political decision to drop CIA's opposition and to go along with the modified set of figures.
But once you make that decision, once you officially say that the enemy is a size you don't believe in, how do you go about making intelligence reports on the enemy subsequently?
That was the source of my frustration.
CIA Director Richard Helms declined to talk to us for this broadcast. But without his authorization, MACV could not have prevailed. It was on Helms's authority that the CIA finally accepted Westmoreland's figure as the official estimate to be sent to the president.
As I say, I didn't talk to Mr. Helms about why he thought we should drop our opposition to the MACV figures, but the feeling was, naturally, there was a political problem, that he didn't want the agency to be perceived as persisting in a line which was contravening the policy interests of the administration.
General Westmoreland had now won the intelligence war. And so instead of being told of an enemy army of more than 500,000, the President, the Congress, and the American public were told there were only 248,000 Viet Cong left, that the enemy was running out of men.
If the military had accepted the CIA's new position, if the National Intelligence Estimate had come out with a claim that the Viet Cong army was almost twice as large as we'd previously thought, what would the consequence have been? What would the reaction be?
Well, it would have scuttled entirely the effort that had been going on that summer to convince the people that the administration's policy was on the right track. It would have meant that Vietnam would be a very important issue in the election in the coming year, 1968, and would have produced all sorts of congressional inquiry and reaction to the war, and would have fed the popular opposition to the war.
But now the CIA had capitulated, and instead of a reevaluation, the administration launched a week-long public relations campaign to convince the American public once and for all that we were winning the war.
Very, very encouraged. I've never been more encouraged during my entire almost 4 years in country. I think we're making real progress. Everybody is very optimistic that I know of who is intimately associated with our effort there.
We are winning in Vietnam militarily.
It's difficult to conceive of a surrender, but it is not difficult to conceive that the enemy may decide that he can't win. And the longer he holds out, the weaker he will get. This is in fact happening, but he does not yet apparently realize this.
Ironically, it was at the same time that General Westmoreland was pronouncing an enemy all but defeated that a momentous decision had been taken in Hanoi. The Viet Cong were ordered to prepare the major offensive of the war. It was to be an all-out attack to, quote, split the sky and shake the earth. It was to begin a few months hence during the Vietnamese holiday known as Tet. These were the North Vietnamese regulars, among the most effective combat troops in the world. They were the enemy soldiers trained in the north, armed by the Russians and Chinese, who infiltrated down the Ho Chi Minh Trail to fight in the south. Up until the fall of 1967, the faking and suppression of estimates of enemy strength had focused on the Viet Cong's local troops in the south, but never on these soldiers. Everyone agreed that every effort must be made accurately to report how many of them were moving south to join the battle. Throughout 1967, General Westmoreland's reports never indicated an infiltration rate higher than 8,000 per month. But CBS Reports has learned that during the 5 months preceding the Tet Offensive, Westmoreland's infiltration analysts had actually been reporting not 7,000 or 8,000, but more than 25,000 North Vietnamese coming down the Ho Chi Minh Trail each month, and that amounted to a near invasion. But those reports of a dramatically increased infiltration were systematically blocked. The man in charge of MACV's infiltration analysts, Colonel Russell Cooley, explained what happened to those reports.
Higher headquarters. These never got past the higher headquarters. Every time these figures went up, they came back and we were given another figure to use for infiltration figures.
In our interview, General Westmoreland surprised us by contradicting his official record and confirming what Colonel Cooley had told us about a massive increase in infiltration prior to Tet.
But I would say it was in the magnitude of about 20,000 a month. That's actually, and this tempo started in the fall and continued.
20,000 a month?
Yes. Of that order of magnitude.
We then reminded General Westmoreland that back in 1967, he had told Congress and the President just the opposite about infiltration, including this statement, which he made on Meet the Press in November of that year.
What about infiltration? A year ago, you said they were infiltrating at the rate of about 7,000 a month. What are they doing today?
I would estimate between 5,500 and 6,000 a month.
And so we asked General Westmoreland to explain that contradiction.
It sounds to me like a misstatement. I don't remember making it, but certainly I could not retain all these detailed figures in my mind.
Well, that's not...
And if I said that, I was wrong. I was wrong.
But how could General Westmoreland have been wrong about the most critical factor in the war? Could he have been misled by his own intelligence chiefs? That seems unlikely, since he says he knew about the increased infiltration. And so the question he could not answer for us: why didn't McVie alert Washington?
So somebody was not sending the proper information.
Well, I have no knowledge that they were sending improper information or inaccurate information. And well, this is a perplexing thing, if true, and I can't believe it is true.
It's all the more puzzling when you consider what was happening at Westmoreland's headquarters on the very day he left for Washington in November 1967, to tell the American public the enemy was running out of men. On that day, a senior intelligence officer, Lieutenant Colonel Everett Parkins, a West Point graduate who planned to make a career of the Army, had become so incensed by McVie's refusal to send on the reports of an enemy infiltration of 25,000 a month, that he lost his temper and shouted at his superior.
Lieutenant Colonel Parkins was fired for trying to get this report through.
He was relieved from his position. Word fired, yes, he was.
And the estimates didn't go through.
No.
What was the message that you all drew from this incident?
Well, the message, sitting back, became very clear. If you're going to go to the extent of being that forceful, you'll just be removed from the job.
You did not know that these reports were being blocked, that a West Pointer had been fired for insisting on sending this report about considerably greater infiltration to the Joint Chiefs?
I have no recollection of that at all.
There was one particular individual who was a keystone behind this, and he had a very, very rapid rise to fame in our higher headquarters in estimating enemy strengths.
And his name was what?
His name was Danny Graham.
He was the one who was blocking the infiltration estimates from going through. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, I'd have to say that.
The man Colonel Cooley was talking about was General Westmoreland's Chief of Estimates, Colonel Daniel Graham. We put Cooley's charges directly to Graham.
You did not block any reports.
I never blocked any reports.
Who did?
Nobody that I know of blocked any reports. If anybody had blocked information going forward, it would have been me, but I never blocked any information going forward. I'm not that dumb.
But someone was blocking them. You heard General Westmoreland himself tell us the infiltration rate was at least 20,000 a month. The official reports, however, issued by General Graham's shop, never showed a rate higher than 7,000. And so the question, why would McVie block such critical reports? Colonel Cooley offers this explanation.
That headquarters itself was under very, very strong pressures. Very strong pressures of General Westmoreland, who had publicly announced that we were entering into what he termed Phase 4, the light is at the end of the tunnel. We're about to wrap this up and we're all going to be home for Christmas type of logic. All of a sudden, now you have an element bringing in higher figures into a system that is so geared up that says, we're winning. It was a dichotomy here that couldn't exist.
What seems to have happened by the fall of 1967 is that the vast and diffuse machinery of American intelligence began simply to break down. In November, after exhaustive monitoring of captured enemy documents, the CIA predicted the Tet Offensive. It was one of the most notable intelligence breakthroughs of any war. But Joe Hovey, the man who predicted it, was not told about the increased enemy infiltration. So although he could write a memo predicting what the enemy intended to do, He had no idea that the Viet Cong had the ability, the numbers, to pull it off.
What was the message in the memo? What were you trying to get across?
All hell was going to break loose, okay? Up until now, the war had been going along at a steady pace, very violent, but still at a steady, relatively low-keyed, long-term pace. Now, suddenly, what you're talking about is Armageddon, you know. The walls are going to come crashing in. They're coming at us with everything they've got.
Hovey wrote that report in Saigon, and before sending it on to the White House, the CIA had Sam Adams review it.
I read it and I said, my Lord, something big is happening. But then as I read it more closely, I noticed that it didn't mention the fact that there were twice as many guys out there.
Let me understand. Hovey is forecasting a big offensive.
Yeah, a big offensive.
By the North Vietnamese, the VC.
That's right.
But he is not talking about the fact that there may be, instead of 300,000, 400 or 500 or 600,000.
No, he isn't talking about that.
He's not talking about the infiltration numbers or anything of that sort.
He doesn't mention infiltration, he doesn't mention anything.
Did it make sense to you what the VC were about to do?
Actually, it did not, because I was still, again, I had no knowledge of these large reinforcements pouring down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And from what I knew of enemy strength estimates, and compared with the kind of power that the American Army had in country, it just seemed to me insane.
Did your comment, along with that prediction of Tet, did your comment go along to the White House, or to Westmoreland, or to anybody?
No, it did not. Just the memo which said something big is coming, not my comment saying that there were twice as many of them to do it.
Didn't anyone feel the need? Well, obviously no one did feel the need to alert the president of the fact that the enemy had a considerably greater capability than was imagined.
Apparently not.
Shouldn't someone from MACV have told the president that not only were the VC planning a massive attack, but that they were flooding the South with North Vietnamese regulars?
Well, sure. That was known. That was known.
The president knew?
I have no idea whether the president knew or not.
Secretary McNamara said in January to the Congress, about 6,000 people a month are coming down. Richard Helms of the CIA said the same thing. The Joint Chiefs of Staff were never told of an infiltration rate of 20,000 a month. Your command history does not mention 20,000 a month coming down. The White House was not told about 20,000 men a month coming down. Where is there a record of this infiltration having been reported to higher authority?
I couldn't answer that without reviewing the records and the messages that were sent.
So from September through late January, when the Tet Offensive erupts, there are over 100,000 North Vietnamese regulars that have come into the South that have not been reported.
That's basically correct.
All the challenges have been met. The enemy is not beaten, but he knows that he has met his master in the field. For what you and your team have done, General Westmoreland, I award you today an oak leaf cluster.
And so the President of the United States, the American Army in Vietnam, and the American public back home were destined to be caught totally unprepared for the size of the attack that was coming the following month. The President had been alerted to the enemy's intentions, but no one had been able or willing to inform him of the enemy's capability. This was Saigon, command headquarters for the 500,000 American troops in Vietnam. In January 1968, a totally secure city, the heart of an increasingly secure South Vietnam. If you accepted the government at its word, 68% of the country was now pacified, meaning the enemy could not operate in those areas. All the cities of South Vietnam were considered secure, and General Westmoreland had just declared that the enemy was on the run, with only 224,000 men left. It was a moment when American power stood at its zenith. No one was prepared for what was about to happen. The enemy launched the Tet Offensive in the early morning hours of January 30th, 1968. They attacked everywhere at once, and what caught everyone by surprise was that they struck in the middle of all of South Vietnam's cities. Suddenly, American soldiers were fighting in the streets of Saigon, desperately trying to keep the Viet Cong from overrunning the city. Everywhere in South Vietnam, American soldiers were on the defensive. The Viet Cong actually captured the ancient capital of Hue. They were on the attack in 40 of the 44 provincial capitals. The enemy was demonstrating a capability that no official report had previously acknowledged. But 3 weeks after the Tet Offensive began, this is what the chairman of the Joint Chiefs wrote to the president. To a large extent, the Viet Cong now control the countryside. The initial attack nearly succeeded in a dozen places. In short, it was a very near thing. He concluded, MACV does not have adequate reserves against the contingency of another large-scale enemy offensive. That's what the chairman of the Joint Chiefs was saying, but from the beginning of the attack, General Westmoreland insisted that Tet was a major defeat for the enemy. He began making this claim on the second day of fighting, just after the American embassy compound had been recaptured from a Viet Cong terror squad, and while battles were still raging everywhere in the country.
Now, yesterday, the enemy exposed himself by virtue of this strategy, and he suffered great casualties.
But General Westmoreland's pronouncements of an enemy on the run were now being questioned. And back home, some of our most trusted voices were openly challenging official assurances that this enemy could be defeated.
For it seems now more certain than ever that the bloody experience of Vietnam is to end in a stalemate. This summer's almost certain standoff will either end in real give and take negotiations or terrible escalation. And for every means we have to escalate, the enemy can match us. And that applies to invasion of the North, the use of nuclear weapons, or the mere commitment of 100 or 200 or 300,000 more American troops to the battle.
Walter Cronkite was articulating the sentiment growing in the country that Tet was a devastating setback. But General Westmoreland was insisting that Tet was a great victory, and it was left to his intelligence officers to document that claim by demonstrating massive losses in the enemy's army. It was at this point, in the weeks after Tet, that things began to careen out of control at MACV Intelligence. Guerrilla analyst Richard MacArthur told us what happened after Tet when he tried to defend the integrity of his figures.
It was called to my attention by a good friend of mine who sat across the desk from me, and he said, Mac, did you see what they did to your figures? Or do you know what they did to your figures? And I said, no, what is it you're trying to say? And he didn't say anything else, and so I just reached down and looked at my figures and saw that they had been cut drastically. They had been cut in half.
Your guerrillas had now been reduced by half without your okay.
Yeah, absolutely. It was done apparently while I was on vacation, while I was on R&R.
So by this time you just say this is business as usual?
No, as a matter of fact, I exploded them. I stormed down to the other end of the hall and walked in and said, Colonel Weiler, I said, oh, hi, you know, and I said, who changed my figures? And the colonel said to me, Mac, lie a little, Mac, lie a little. Well, I said, I'm not going to lie a little, and I did an about-face, turned around, and marched out of his office. It was a very strange time for me because, you see, I really didn't know who to complain to. I didn't know whose attention to bring this to because I didn't know, don't forget, this was a pretty high, this Combined Intelligence Center was really the intelligence arm of MACV. And I didn't know, honestly, who to speak to. I mean, it wasn't as though you could go and see the chaplain or somebody, you know. I mean, I didn't know who was really involved in this thing. I'll tell you that, honestly, I didn't know if some day I might wind up in the Saigon River because I said, hey, look, you know, something's going wrong. People are changing these numbers. What's happening here?
The atmosphere was that intense.
It was that intense, yes.
Shortly after, MacArthur was transferred. MACV Intelligence, meanwhile, went ahead and produced its first official estimate of enemy strength after Tet. This is that document sent on to the Pentagon and the White House, listing an enemy reduced to 204,126 men. And this is Commander James Meacham, the officer in charge of putting out that report. So troubled was Meacham that he wrote home every night confessing to what he was being asked to do.
He's writing in March of 1968, telling his wife about how MACV was going about faking the first order of battle report after Tet. I quote from his letter. "We started with the answer and plugged in all sorts of figures until we found the combination which the machine could digest, and then we wrote all sorts of estimates showing why the figures were right, which we had to use, and we continue to win the war." Did you believe, sir, that the OB reports coming out after Tet were honest?
What an individual writes to his wife may or may not be an objective account. Now, it was the prerogative of Joe Davison, who was my intelligence chief, to introduce some logic and some common sense into estimates.
But as we shall see, after Tet, there was nothing logical about MACV's statistics on the enemy.
How many troops did he lose, General?
Well, in the first week, out of a commitment, according to our intelligence, of about 84,000 that were committed in the early days of the Tet Offensive, he lost 35,000.
Killed?
Killed.
And how many wounded?
Well, we have no way of knowing that, but usually the ratio is about 3 to 1, 3 wounded for 1 that is killed.
If you take General Westmoreland at his word, here is the logical problem you run into. It begins with MACV's official estimate of total combined enemy strength in the South just before Tet, 224,000. 5 weeks later, on March 7th, Westmoreland reported 50,000 of those enemy had been killed. Now, according to his own standard ratio, for every 1 killed, 3 were wounded. So even disregarding the enemy soldiers who defected or were captured, the bottom line figure just didn't make sense. If so many Viet Cong had been taken out of action, the question had to be asked, whom were we fighting? MACV's intelligence officers discovered the problem when they started to feed the enemy loss figures into their computers. Colonel Cooley explains.
When we put those figures in, the enemy loss figures were so high we had almost no enemy left in country. And people, the analysts and our headquarters would look at that and say, this is unbelievable. This is a little too unbelievable.
According to Colonel Cooley, there was a general agreement at this time that something had to be done. Cooley and another senior intelligence officer, Commander James Meacham, have told CBS Reports that several weeks after Tet, Colonel Daniel Graham, General Westmoreland's chief of estimates, asked them to alter MACV's historical record. In effect, they then accused Graham of personally engineering a cover-up. First, Commander Meacham.
There comes a time when Colonel Graham asked you and Colonel Weiler to tamper with the computer's memory, to change the database in some way.
That's it.
You said no.
Well, we didn't say no. I mean, this thing wasn't our private property. It belonged to the Intelligence Directorate. We were the custodians of it. We didn't like what Danny Graham proposed to do. We didn't want him to do it. At the end of the day, we lost the fight and he did it.
What was so wrong about going back into the memory? What got Meacham so distressed about it?
I would, a little bit of the 1984 syndrome here, you know, where you can obliterate something or you can alter it to the point where it never existed type of logic.
Up to that time, even though some of the current estimates and the current figures had been juggled around with, we had not really tinkered with our database, if I can use that jargonistic word. And Danny Graham was asking us to do it. We didn't like it.
Oh, for crying out loud. I never ask anybody to wipe out the computer's memory. I don't know what I honestly haven't got any idea what he's talking about.
We stress that Colonel Graham denies the allegation and insists that he never falsified nor suppressed any intelligence reports on the enemy. But Commander Meacham and Colonel Cooley insist that Graham did alter the record, and they suggest that because of this, we may never be able to go back and understand exactly what happened.
You can't go back and do things like that. Nobody will ever piece this war together. We didn't know how anybody pieced together as it was. But, you know, things like the Tet Offensive become a little clearer when you see this type of interplay. if you went back and changed all of those figures, you'd never be able to say, how did this happen? Why did it happen? Why weren't we standing out there waiting for these people when they started, you know, running across the rice paddies?
Commander Meacham, late June '68. The types from DIA, Defense Intelligence Agency, were here and badgered me endlessly, trying to pry the truth from my sealed lips. They smell a rat, but they don't really know where to look for it. They know we are falsifying the figures, but can't figure out which ones and how. 3 days... We then told Westmoreland of another letter written a few days later by Meacham. Quote, "Today I wrote a long memo for the director on how the estimates bunch has lied in the past on strength figures," unquote. Colonel Daniel Graham ran the estimates shop.
My contacts with Graham indicated that he was an experienced, knowledgeable intelligence officer.
Maybe he just wanted to feed you good news, General Westmoreland.
No.
You wanted to feed Lyndon Johnson good news?
I don't know why he would want to feed me good news. I mean, I knew him very casually. I had never known him before.
Clearly, something was terribly wrong with McVeigh's reports on the enemy. Nonetheless, in the weeks after the Tet Offensive began, President Johnson continued to rely on General Westmoreland's assurances that we were winning. Right after Tet, he had rushed 13,000 combat troops to the war zone, and no one questioned this limited commitment in the face of an all-out enemy offensive. But when news leaked to the press in March that General Westmoreland had requested 206,000 additional troops, the country was stunned. It seemed to be an admission that the 500,000 American soldiers already in Vietnam couldn't cope with the enemy. Still, Lyndon Johnson held firm as he tried desperately to rally support for his war effort.
But I point out to you the time has come when we ought to unite, when we ought to stand up and be counted, when we ought to support our leaders, our government, our men, and our allies until aggression is stopped.
The president had been determined to see the war through, but by the end of the month, he could no longer ignore the mounting criticism. And on March the 25th, he summoned a council of trusted advisors, the so-called wise men. Their task, to assess the war effort and advise the president.
The wise men had met once before, 5 months earlier. They had listened to briefings from the CIA and the military, and they had advised the president to disregard public criticism and carry on with the war. But now these same wise men were about to be given a different set of facts.
On the 20th of March, 1968, I was asked, and obeyed the order, I was asked to bring together an estimate of how many enemy there were. And I said there were about 600,000. And I understand it was used to brief the so-called wise men, Lyndon Johnson's senior advisors. They included Dean Acheson, George Ball, Arthur Goldberg, Maxwell Taylor, and so forth.
What had happened is that after Tet, the CIA had regained the courage of its convictions. And among other things, they told the wise men of the CIA's belief that we were fighting a dramatically larger enemy. That was at least one of the reasons why Lyndon Johnson's advisors concluded that despite the military's insistence that we were winning, the enemy could not, in fact, be defeated at any acceptable cost.
The wise men then stunned the president by urging him to begin pulling out of the war. 5 days later, a sobered Lyndon Johnson addressed the nation.
I shall not seek, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
2 months after the president's speech, General William Westmoreland was transferred back to Washington and promoted to become Chief of the Army. To this day, General Westmoreland insists that the enemy was virtually destroyed at Tet. Be that as it may, the fighting in Vietnam went on for 7 more years after the Tet Offensive. 27,000 more American soldiers were killed. Over 100,000 more were wounded. And on April 30th, 1975, that same enemy entered Saigon once again. Only this time, it was called Ho Chi Minh City. Sam Adams, the man who first alerted the government to the existence of a larger enemy, became increasingly disillusioned with the CIA after the Tet Offensive. He finally resigned and began a 10-year effort to get his story told. George Allen